welcome back to another brand new episode of
Tag and Bag.
Oh, that one was sharp. That came in crispy. Thanks again, Jeff, for jumping onto another episode of our jolly podcast that we have together. This week, our focus is on literature, books, stories that have really excited and engaged us, and kind of treating this fourth episode almost a bit like a recommendations list, a book club. So we're kind of putting out a little bit, some of the stuff that we've really enjoyed, and also perhaps giving people something new to engage with in a different format. I know I certainly don't read as much as I would like to. I've never really gotten into audiobooks or paperbacks in certainly in the last few years, but I know it's something I really miss. And a bit like how we talked about the work-life balance and carving time for things that are important, I know that reading is quite high on my priority list to really get back to. Given the amount of hours that you're spending, on projects that you're working on, either from home or if you ever have to do a guest spot or a convention appearance, do you get time to indulge in literature and reading, or is it something
Oh,
like me that I'm desperately trying to get back to?
no, all the time.
Brilliant.
I really have nothing that is, that gets in the way of my reading. I mean, if, for instance, I'm going to go to a convention, I always have a Kindle with me, or my
Nice.
iPad has the Kindle app, so I can read whatever it is I've been reading. My problem is that I tend to read like 6 or 7 things at once, which
Oh,
is not a real
right.
good way to do it.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
I
sort of
have that
jumping
same
around
problem
and
with, yeah, no, totally. I have that same problem with both games and TV shows, where I
yeah,
almost, it's almost like the shiny object syndrome, right? Where you look at something and you go, yes, but now I want to
squirrel.
try this, and
Yeah, absolutely.
you sort of make
Yeah,
no
and
progress.
that's really the only problem I have as far as finding time to read. I read pretty much anywhere I go. I mean, for instance, I go to a gym that's ways away from where I live, but while I'm on a treadmill, I always have something I'm reading while I'm walking, which
Nice.
is great. And very often I will, late in the afternoon, I'll just sit down and start, pick something up and I'll start reading it and, see how far I go. And before I decide I'm hungry, it's time to make supper.
Nice.
And
Is
then in
that
the evening, after I've watched a couple of things, I may think, all right, that's enough watching TV. Let's read something and sort
That's
of,
yeah, nice. So
that's
it
it.
is a well-established part of your routine then. That's great.
Oh, yeah.
Do you tend to prefer, I know you mentioned the Kindle and having it on your iPad, but do you tend to prefer it in the digital format, or would you want it to be that the hard copy? Do you have one you gravitate to more than the other?
I would always prefer that it were a hard copy if the print is large enough.
Sure.
A lot of sometimes it's a matter of font, sometimes it's a matter of the size of the print. Some of the font is just harder to kind of, take in
Yeah.
um on some things. It's very odd how that can be. And then sometimes it's just so small that I have a hard time seeing it.
Yeah, and
And the nice thing about a Kindle is, of course, you can make it as big as you want. You can often change the font. You can put a different background on it, although I never do. I mean, I pretty much always read black print against a white background.
yes, yeah, if I was ever using anything like that, I think I'd want to use the sort of
Excuse me.
the more traditional kind of formatting for that. It can
Yeah.
so often, particularly for people that really struggle with either their eyesight or dyslexia or anything that sort of becomes a barrier, if you've got
Yeah.
something like that that's printed in such a way that it becomes inaccessible to them, that can, I think, for a lot of people become a real turnoff for kind of wanting to get
Yeah.
involved with that. And it's such a, it's such an important part of the work I do in education. We have a big push right now with our young people
Absolutely.
about reading. We had 2,000 new books delivered to
Wow.
our school library in the last year. It's been a
Wow.
real big thing, and they've actually just
Yeah.
launched this thing called Sparks Reader. It's essentially all the students in the class have they do an hour a week of this. They have iPads. Every student has an iPad in the lesson, and all the
Uh-huh.
books, kind of like on Kindle, they're digitally formatted. But I have access. They all log in, and I have access to a tracker, and I can see how many words they've read, how much and they have to
Oh,
answer questions as well. So they have
sure.
comprehension questions while they're reading to check engagement and
Whoa.
understanding. And
Sure.
then they then continue outside of those lessons reading the hard copies of those same books.
Wow.
So it's a
Wow.
really great way, particularly because it can be so easy, I think, for young people to be apathetic to this stuff and become really disengaged with the idea of reading, especially if they know it's not something they've ever done for pleasure or just in their own
Mm,
time. Very easy to just scroll, right?
yeah.
So it's a great, I think it's been a really clever way to readdress that paradigm a little bit, move them away from just being on the device. But that
Yeah.
being said, you've just made an excellent case for the fact that it does make it much more accessible. You can be anywhere, pull out that iPad, pull out that Kindle, and you've got your library sitting there waiting for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes I'll just go and I'll drive off to some place, like there's a terrific view out onto Puget Sound, which is a big body of water that separates us on the mainland from the peninsula. And I'll just, sit there with a cup of coffee and my little iPad, and I'll read and take in the sunshine if it's a beautiful day. And even if it's a rainy day, sometimes I'll just sit and read for a bit. Yeah, I'm
Yeah, my
hardly ever without a book.
yeah, no, that's great. My wife is the same. If it could be like we could be having a hailstorm outside, and then she's like, "But I'm under the canopy, like it's all good.
Exactly.
I'm enjoying the hell out of it."
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
in
me
terms
too.
of we've addressed a lot in our previous podcast conversations we've had together about influences, particularly in the theater and that world, and both content you've enjoyed consuming, but also working on as both an actor and director. Are there types of novels, fiction, non-fiction things you gravitate to more than others? And
Yeah,
if so, what are they?
yeah. Well, I'm very, very broad in terms of my tastes. It really is, as you say, that sort of, shiny object syndrome where it's like, oh, that sounds interesting. Let's go ahead and download it. Easy enough to do. And sometimes I'll actually follow up on it, and sometimes I'll lose interest. But I would say that one of the big things that has happened to me when I was younger, I got very interested in what at the time was being referred to as the new fiction. And oddly enough, that would have included people like Kurt Vonnegut Jr. and Donald Barthelme and I'm blanking now on some of the different people who were in Ronald Sukenik. There were a bunch of different people, Robert Coover, who were as interested in form as they were, I guess you could say, in content, but they sort of, were taking some real interesting um, paths away from what had been kind of the typical literature that I had first started reading. And I was very excited about that. But the older I get, the more I'm less interested in what I think of as flash and
Mm,
glitter and all of that sort of thing. I'm looking for more substance, and I am looking for something that is going to have an emotional impact. There's nothing I like better than being moved by something I read. So in recent years, I have, much to my embarrassment, because I think of myself as being reasonably well read, and all my friends think I'm much better read than I am. But I've begun to read classics that I just never got around to. Those books that, well, someday, when I've got more
yeah,
time,
for
I'll
sure.
sit
The
down and
ones that
read
are
them.
they're forever on the backlog, aren't they? And that's something that,
Yeah,
it's something I'm very aware of. Again, not just within books, but across all media, that I kind of
sure.
look at the never-ending parchment scroll of things I know I've always said I'll get to it. I'll pick it up, you know.
Yeah, well, in some instances, I actually have. I did read War and Peace, which was
Nice.
fascinating. I read Moby Dick, which was absolutely transcendent, an amazing novel. I finally read The Heart of Darkness, which most people have read in school, and for some reason I never did, and I was blown away by that. And I finally read David Copperfield, which that was one of those ones that just managed to wring me out at the end of
Mm.
almost every chapter. I was so moved, so entertained, so delighted. Those are the kind of books that these days I'm more inclined to want to tackle than some of the more. But yet, with that said, recently I read Ann Patchett's Tom Lake, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I read the latest Damore Towell's book, The Lincoln Highway. He wrote A Gentleman in Moscow, which they've made into a
Oh, cool.
television
That I do
series.
know.
Yeah,
Nice.
fabulous, fabulous
Yeah.
writer. I'm trying to think what else I've been reading. A bunch of different things. There are some books that I have sort of in the queue that I'm hoping to get to. One of them is called James, and it's the Huckleberry Finn story from the point of view of Jim, the
Oh,
slave.
cool.
Yeah,
Nice.
and it's written by the guy who wrote the book Erasure, that the American film American Fiction, which was up for some Oscars
Mm.
this year and starred Jeffrey Wright and Sterling K. Brown, among others.
Who Jeffrey Wright, by the way, I think is one of the most outstanding actors working.
Absolutely, no question, just
Great
terrific.
reference. See, this is also partially like slightly selfish of me too. It's like a good selfish because just hearing any of the recommendations you're making, I'm definitely making a a quick mental
Well,
list.
I mean, and then other things that are on my mind right now. As I said, I was yesterday we were talking, or the last time we were talking, I guess, um,
That's right. It was weeks ago.
weeks ago when we had our last get together.
Oh, I'm keeping it in.
I mentioned that I was reading a bunch of books on Buddhism, and I'm reading a very interesting book by a French monk. Interesting books, actually. There's a whole series of them. His name is Matthew Ricard. I think that's how it might be pronounced. It's spelled not like Matthew normally is, but it's
Mm.
Mathieu, I believe.
All right.
Mathieu Ricard. Really, really interesting. Somebody who had started out his career in science, and then at a certain point decided he had to go to the East and become a monk, which is what he did, much to the chagrin of his father, who I believe was an historian, if I'm not
Mm.
mistaken. And they actually have a book together where they talk about their different perspectives. And the father, obviously, still at that point had not quite, managed to accept the fact that this was what his son had done. Really interesting writer, really enjoy his stuff. And I've been reading a bunch of things on simple living, homesteading. Not that I intend to, you know, go out in the middle of nowhere and try and farm an acre of land or anything, but I'm just
Don't
very
sell yourself short though.
intrigued. No, well, I mean, you never say never, I suppose, but I'm just very interested in, trying to, as I always do, learn some new things. And in some instances, if I want to make something for myself, make it in such a way that I know exactly what went into it. So I'm
Mm.
not dealing with, the sort of garbage that gets foisted on us in so many grocery stores.
Yeah.
More and more that's of interest.
No, I get that. And actually, having that mindset, that is a very active choice you're taking there, which is that you're using it not just as purely for entertainment and consumption, but that it can be an enhancement to your understanding of something or learning how something is created. That
Yeah,
I definitely lean closer to that, I think, currently than just absorbing fiction. I think I'm much
right,
more sort of tutorial driven and wanting to learn a skill through reading, through study. That's something that
right.
definitely I've really connected with. And actually, and through my work as a teacher, I've ended up having to teach quite a bit of English in my school as well.
Mm,
Drama being my focus, but English being sort of like a secondary subject. I
sure.
have an English degree, so I think that's where they've looked at me and gone, well, you know what a semicolon is, go teach that for a bit, So
So are you teaching literature?
yeah, so the first year that I was there, I was leading on content. So I had a year 7 class and a year 8 class. They would be a sort of about between ages sort of 11 and 13, sort of that
Wow.
that sort of bracket. And the
Yeah.
curriculum at my school is quite, especially for year 7. So this would be the first year of high school, I guess would be the equivalent. Quite ambitious for their age group.
Yeah.
We study, they have a chronological curriculum. So we start in year 7 with them with the Odyssey, with Homer's Odyssey, and that then progresses
Fabulous.
into Beowulf, into the Canterbury Tales,
Wow. Yeah, yeah.
into Julius Caesar. So that
Wow.
becomes the syllabus, and that's a year 7. That's their first year of secondary or high school.
Oh,
Um,
that's exciting.
yeah, it is, and I hadn't ever read Homer's Odyssey in its entirety, and of course
Really?
did. I know because
Which version did you read?
so this was I mean, there's been several adapted texts because the translation was always so inaccurate, and it's been
Yeah,
reprinted and republished, ad infinitum, and the same again actually with the Canterbury Tales. A lot of the original version just didn't exist, so they've had to extrapolate a lot of the text and the story.
sure.
but I'd only ever studied it sort of, it was always in the context of a drama class. It was always, let's extract this Odysseus monologue. Let's look at, him talking about Scylla or Charybdis or the Cyclops or any of these sort of, these fantastical characters. It was always out of context. It was always for the purpose of exploring through performance. Whereas, of
Yeah.
course, very different when you're sat behind the desk. It's all very about comprehension and understanding. And it actually did that definitely helped me and encouraged me to get into something that perhaps I wouldn't have sought out purely for entertainment or from
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of just consuming material. It gave it a reason for me to do it because I wanted to make
Right.
sure I was the one I could be a go-to. If you never want to be in a position where you feel like you're having to blag it, in a conversation with a student or whatever. You want to feel informed, and I felt pretty secure in my subject knowledge for drama, but definitely not
Right.
for English. So it was a
Ah,
great. I saw it as a great opportunity, and it was also just a great story as well, which then
yeah.
leads into the curriculum. I think is really well designed because I then started year 8 with Romeo and Juliet, which again
Oh,
had never read in its entirety. I'd only studied sections of it.
sure.
My background was Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Cymbeline. They were
Sure.
the plays that I and The Tempest as well. They were the ones I
Love
absolutely
the
ate up
Tempest.
growing up. But I
Yeah.
hadn't ever properly read Romeo and Juliet, and my teaching gave me the reason to do that,
Wow.
which was
That's
a
great.
great thing. Do you think you've been surprised sometimes by the material you've ended up actually
Oh,
really
sure.
connecting
Oh,
with?
absolutely. Absolutely.
It definitely was
Yeah.
for
I mean,
me.
a good example of that was Moby Dick. I mean, I
Right.
had sort of always bought into the notion that it was unreadable, that it was just so, ridiculously bound up in the minutia of
Mhm.
whaling. And I thought, well, how can that possibly be interesting? And indeed, the story that we know from like the film with Gregory Peck is a very, very, small portion of the book itself.
Yeah.
But the world as it is revealed in that book is absolutely extraordinary. And there are some images that I don't think I'll ever forget. There's one point when the whalers all go out and find themselves in the middle of a pod of whales, and Ishmael looks down and sees this mother is nursing like all these different whales, but he can see it under the water below him. And and they're, in danger of being smashed and submerged and all that kind of thing. It's an extraordinary sequence.
And really makes you sort
Absolutely.
of like it really,
Oh,
it inflames your imagination, doesn't it? That's great.
absolutely.
It really,
Absolutely.
material with great imagery has always been something I've really appreciated, and it's where I
Hmm.
then struggled with things like I always struggled with things like Frankenstein, looking at the original versions of those texts because I'd
Really?
seen so many
Oh,
filmic
the films?
adaptations. Yeah.
Sure.
And it was almost like the image in my mind wasn't coming from the text; it was coming from the memory of watching an old serial or watching an old
Oh, sure, sure,
movie.
sure.
So
Sure.
it is that classic sort of almost chicken and the egg problem of what
Mm.
version do you attack first? I always think, it can be tricky, can't it, if you've read a great story, then you see the film or TV show, and it never quite lines up with the thing that you'd imagined.
Yeah.
Equally, if the reverse happens, you watch the film first, then you get to the book, you think, well, that's not what it looks like. That's not how they sounded, or that's not how they because I've had my perception of that already shaped. So it's a really
Right.
tricky problem I find that to sort of divorce and separate those two things. Equally, at the same time, if something say take something like a graphic novel like The Walking Dead, when that's been
Mm.
adapted into a TV show, I don't just want a like for like uh recreation of that in a new format. Interpret, take it in another direction, which they did for
Oh,
that particular show. And I always
yeah.
tend to prefer that. It always feels like though it's like it's case by case. If it's something I'm really like, if it's a book or a story it's very personal to me, I then have a real stake in it being done right. Oh no, you've got to
Yeah.
have that character, you've got to have that line of dialogue or that moment. And it can become tricky to sort of separate yourself from the art itself and then the way they've adapted it. That can be a really
Yeah.
tricky kind of dynamic to navigate. Um,
Yeah.
no more so than in my all-time favorite novel. I have something that I just adore. It's William Golding's Lord of the Flies. It is my
Oh gosh, yeah.
all-time favorite story. I got an opportunity as a a very sort of painfully pubescent 15-year-old to appear in the production of it in
Wow.
the Watford Palace, which is a theatre.
Wow.
It's an off kind of London
Oh,
West
I know
End
what it is.
stage, yeah. And it was technically youth theatre, but they
Right.
treated it with the same gravitas and care and budget that we afforded to a full scale production. And we had, um, like the tip of the top of a plane, like a Boeing 747, which has got the logo, the airline branding on it. We had a
Yeah.
full size recreation with a rig that we could all, as the kids, as the survivors,
Oh.
climb up and swing from and access. And it was, I mean, it really got me so into the source material and therefore into the book, because the play adaptation is very different, but it got me so invested in that world, and to the point where I then wrote a sequel,
Oh my
almost an
gosh.
alternative sequel version that I then wrote and directed with my own drama school. And it
Wow.
was I always found the one part of it I never liked was the ending. Spoiler alert, they all get rescued. And I always thought it was a really sort of soft and neatly tied up with a bow conclusion to that narrative. And
Mm,
I made it so that the kids essentially sort of revolted. They didn't get rescued when the sailors came in to take them home. They took
right.
them prisoner, and that was the finale of the story, which then allowed me to write a follow-up. We almost did like a
Oh.
sort of theatrical sequel to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And because of I
Okay.
was just so invested in the characters, and I loved the world that they created, that was all rooted in that source material, and something I really truly was so passionate about. And I was wondering, I mean, it's really tough given the fact that I think you've definitely exposed yourself to a broader spectrum of material than I have. And I think that would make your choice of something like that tricky, potentially. The idea of singling in on a single story that you could say, well, that is the absolute best book I've ever read.
Oh,
Is that
yeah.
something you could speak to? And I have to say, I know that would be tricky, potentially.
Um, no,
Right.
I haven't. For some reason, it's weird. I mean, I think it's more common to have that conversation, perhaps around films.
Yep.
What are your favorite movies? That
Hmm.
kind of thing. I'm a big fan of something called Letterboxd, where people are sort of waylaid at premieres by the people in this company and asked to name their four favorite films of all time, which is impossible. I mean, that you just can't do it. Even
Oh,
10
yes, I've seen this.
on
Yeah,
YouTube,
it's
it
popped
pops
up
up
on,
and stuff. Or
yeah.
it's a little bit like Desert Island Discs,
Mm,
which I adore. And it's so, of course, I fantasize about what my eight would be. And it's like, well, that's impossible too. You
yeah.
simply can't do it. It's sort of the same with books, but mostly because in that particular instance, there are so many genres and
Mm.
kinds of books, and it's very much a case of not just apples and oranges, but apples and oranges and squashes and legs of lamb and and wheels, tires, and
Yeah.
it's just there's so many different kinds of reading experiences. I would not really, I can't even think, what would be most recently. I think David Copperfield
Nice.
emerged as one of my favorite books.
Yeah, nice. Less of
So
a
much
less of
so
a
that I'd like to
ranking,
read
more
it
of a
again.
yeah, less of a ranking, more of a that just was impactful. It was something you'd always wanted to get back to.
Totally, totally. And there are lots of other books. I mean, Kosinski's The Painted Bird, which I think I mentioned.
Mm,
It's a great, great book. There's just so much. I love thrillers. I love mysteries,
mm,
certain science fiction. I love the Foundation trilogy. When I first read it by Isaac Asimov, I mean, I thought those were terrific books. Stranger in a Strange Land was a book that had a big impact on me. A lot of Ray Bradbury, Something Wicked This Way Comes. I mean, I could
nice.
go on and on and on and on about all the different things that have been, really intriguing. I
Interesting.
also
Yeah.
do love the Greeks, Greek
No, so yeah,
drama,
it's interesting that you say
Greek
about
literature.
genre as well. Like
Yeah,
that's a big part of it, is that you've not pigeonholed yourself. You've allowed yourself to explore across those various genres and those styles of literature. Um, Classical stuff. I mean, I adore Cymbeline, the
oh
Shakespeare play
yes,
Cymbeline, because
absolutely.
it's so duplicitous and it's so It's Shakespeare indulging that darker edge, which was always present in so much of his work, and that
Mm,
it is those ones that are indelible for me. They do stick with me. And
yeah,
just like the, I suppose in your case where you've said about those books that you always knew that you wanted to get back to, but now finally have,
yeah,
and they've
yeah.
had that intended effect, you know.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes I find that I like the early and late books of an author, which are often the more
Mm,
problematic ones. So for Shakespeare, I like some of the early, works quite a lot because I think there's more there than people tend to give it credit for. One thinks of Love's Labor's Lost, which people are always saying, well, it's not a very good play. It's like, except every time it's done, it's successful. And people are like, this is an incredible play. Um, and then all the late so-called problem plays, which I don't have nearly as many problems with as some people do, are plays that absolutely, absorb me. I
yeah.
like them a lot.
Yeah, because I definitely find myself, especially in some of the ones you've just mentioned there as well, I have that sort of almost director hat on. I look at the way that they're describing the particular scenes or the content of something, and I go, well, I know how I'd stage that. I know what the blocking would look like. I know what actors
Sure.
I'd pick. You know, you can't help. I think sometimes I do find myself watching, particularly with film and TV. I watch it. I'm looking at camera choices. I'm looking at how many takes was this? Do I think was this an uncut take? Was it almost? I can't help now. Certainly the older I've gotten, the more I've ended up looking at material from with a different perspective than just consuming it.
Yeah,
I
I
should be
have
able to
to, and
just
I'm
switch that off,
I'm
but
sorry that I do. There was a period of time, it used to be that, I got that way about plays. It was terrible.
mm.
I'd go to, a play, and if I was in the least bit bored, which I often was, I'd find myself looking up at the grid and saying, what lights are they using? Oh,
I
that's
know,
interesting.
I know totally.
Look at all those Fresnels and, oh, that's so interesting. And I go, oh, yeah, back to the play. And I didn't have that same response for films
Mm.
because I didn't really know much about it. And then I started doing little things in them, and it was like, oh, I had one scene in a TV series. It was the remake of The Fugitive, where we were supposed to be in a car. I was with Michael T. Williamson, the original Bubba Gump in Forrest Gump, who was playing the Tommy Lee Jones role. And we were having a conversation, and everybody was talking about, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to do this. I can't remember I can't remember exactly what they called it, but it was the two of us driving at night, but we weren't. We were in a great big huge warehouse. They just turned off all the lights, and they had, lights that created the impression that we were being passed or we were passing cars. There was
Mm.
rain going on. They had little tiny like Christmas tree lights under the dashboard to illuminate us. It was, and they also had people rocking the car so it looked like we were going over
There was
bumps and stuff.
movement to.
Totally, totally. And we never moved anywhere. I mean, we were just in this one place. And you now, of course, every time I see a shot like that in a TV series, it's like, damn it, I don't want to know what's going
No,
on
I know
because now
you
my
don't.
mind is on that. And I
Yeah,
want to be
it's
swept away,
what a
whether it's a
specific
book or a
problem.
play or a movie or TV. I want to be sucked in and
Yes.
taken somewhere else.
Yes, I can't have this. I can't have. I know. I mean, my wife is incredible at this. She can have like a real crime drama going on in the background while she's like
Oh, I can't.
doing some like
No,
bookkeeping.
no,
Like
no, can't do it.
I'm so simple that I have to have the sort of the tunnel vision to be like I am
Yeah,
watching this thing right now.
I don't buy multitasking as a concept at all. I
No,
mean,
I
and in
always just
fact,
think
there's
you're
reason to believe that it doesn't really exist. We'd
no.
like to believe it, but
No, I agree. I think you're basically half-arsing several things when you're
yeah,
multitasking.
yeah. And it's like, no, I want to dig in.
Yeah, to the point where like if say for example like we're watching something right now we're I've introduced my stepdaughter to Star Trek, so we're really getting into we're
Oh
watching
yeah.
Voyager and we're in like season 6, it's like a little dinner time show. And if she has a question about like some technobabble or some sci-fi, backstory there, um I don't talk over the episode. I will pause that to
Yeah,
discuss it and then continue
yeah,
watching. It's a
yeah.
real pet peeve of mine if people like talk over a thing.
I agree completely.
You have to just, you know what? Just be present. It's okay to kind of keep it to yourself for a couple hours. You're watching a film. just shut
And
up.
it's important you'll remember the
Yes,
question. If you don't
precisely.
remember it, you didn't need to know,
It didn't
you know?
matter in the instance when you felt the need to talk over that really key
Yeah,
character beat.
yeah,
Just
exactly.
keep
Oh
it to
no, it makes me
yourself.
crazy.
Yeah.
Talking in movie theater. It's one of the reasons I don't go to movie theaters more often. It's like,
Mm.
I don't have to worry about me when I'm sitting at home watching it on a great big, huge, big TV. Well, pretty big TV, but but in a movie theater, it's like the people who, are on their phones or they're talking or they're
Oh,
walking back and
yeah.
forth for their food. It's like,
Well, that's
I don't
another
like
one I
that.
really can't get on board with is like I've seen these places which have like you've got like servers and waiters coming in taking orders in
Yeah,
the middle of
terrible
me
idea.
watching Black Panther. I'm
Terrible
like,
idea.
no,
No,
no, no,
don't
just
want that there.
have your
No,
burger afterwards. I've got my
totally.
snacks, I've got my popcorn. Be
Yes,
present and
come
watch, you know?
come fed, and then you can go out and, have a little something afterwards if you like, but please,
I agree.
please. Yeah.
I even have the thing where if I'm in person, if like for instance my phone goes off or whatever and we're watching something, and I know I have to reply to something, I will say,
Mm-hmm.
can we just pause for a minute? Just
Yeah.
while I do that. And then but ideally this would be inaccessible. I often leave this on the other side of the room so that I'm not tempted to check. Because it's
Yeah.
so easy to, and also that side of it is there is a bit of nuance there, which is that sometimes you have to. You're, you've got multiple things you're having to think about and consider. It's not you can never 100% I think switch off from everything, even though the effort's there. You want to have that separation, but you're never
Oh, I
not
can
aware of
do
your
it.
yeah.
I can do it sometimes.
I think you're just never not aware of your surroundings though, and especially if
Oh,
you
sure.
see that little ping go off and then you see who it is, you
Well, that's
sometimes
that's
can't
why
help
it's a
it.
good idea to put your phone away and not have to worry
Yeah,
about that. I agree.
totally.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I really do, and I think there is something quite profound about being just present and doing one thing, whether that's
Yes.
watching a film, reading a book. I the most I suppose I would do this would be as if I'm writing or I'm editing. I do like a bit of background music, or I might have a
Sure.
podcast on in the background, but I'm not watching the video of that podcast. I can't have that going and then a document open and I'm working on a monologue that I'm writing. This
Mm,
that can't happen for me. That's too much split focus. A bit, I suppose the passive stuff, like having like Nora Jones, the singer Nora Jones is a big one for me in terms of background listening, and a
yeah.
podcast as well. The Easy Allies are a lovely podcast group I follow. That part I can get on board with, but even that's my pinnacle. That's my maximum that I could achieve there because I just want to be grounded and present in the moment when I am reading, listening, or watching that thing, whatever it may be,
I would agree with that completely.
which we are saying while recording a podcast that people are definitely going to have on in the background. Um, so,
Well, I mean, if they want to, that's entirely up to them, of course. But,
of course.
it's one of the reasons why when I sit down to like watch any of the podcasts that I watch,
Mm.
I tend to try and go, okay, here, I've got my cup of coffee. I'm going to sit down here. I'm going to listen to the whole thing all the way through. And, and then move on to whatever else I've got planned. But yeah, I'm not really into jumping around too much.
No, I
And
agree.
I don't like to have audiobooks or podcasts while I'm driving because I'm old enough that, getting this, keeping concentrated is hard
Yeah,
enough.
so
Without going, oh, that's
absolutely.
so interesting. And
Yeah,
that's it.
for sure. That do you, by the way, with podcasts, do you prefer audio or video?
Well, I mean, the podcast that I tend to watch the most, no, I like video. I think it's pretty good. I
Mm,
enjoy that. I mean, I like seeing the people because I think there are certain things you miss by not being able to see their faces. And
I
if you're
agree.
just hearing sounds, sometimes you can't tell who's doing what exactly when. I'm a big fan of Pod Save America and
Mm.
Conan O'Brien. So it's great to sort of see what
Oh, the
everybody is up to.
you
So,
referencing the Conan one, his show Conan Needs a Friend.
yes.
When he
Terrific.
interviewed Sir Patrick Stewart on there,
Oh, yes.
and some of the looks and some of those non-verbal stuff you would totally miss, obviously on a recording. That
Totally. Totally.
that's
Yeah.
where the real benefit of it is. And actually, we've found everything we've done on the Burly Bird Media has the stuff that people have gravitated to most has been the video. stuff.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
compared
Well,
to,
we're
and
a
we
visual, we're a visual civilization now.
yeah, no, for sure. And that is a fantastic way to say thank you so much, Jeff, for jumping again onto another episode of Tag and Bag. You can find us on all of the various socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitch as well, at Burly Bird Media. You can find the legendary Jeff Steitzer at jeffsteitzervoiceactor.com, as well as on Cameo. He's taking bookings on there if you want a personalized shout out. You'll see the links, description, all in underneath the video. Thank you so much, Jeff, again for jumping on
Thank
another
you.
podcast with me.
Of course.
So that has been Tag a Bag with me, Jonathan Garrett, and the legendary Jeff Steitzer. I made sure I modified my wrap up to include myself in this 4th episode.
Oh, thank God. I'm so relieved.
I'm sure other people are as well, having no idea who I am. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Well, that was funny. That was
great.
Good. I like that.
I had to sneak that in there, man, because I feel like
I'm
that's
so glad you did. I thought it was great. No, it's great. I mean, it's like, you're the co-host of this thing. In fact, you're really the host, and I'm the cranky uncle that shows up every once in a while. So